Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
So my name is Yingyi Hong, Kang Yingyi, a professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'm honored to be the moderator for Fanny's keynote. Sorry for the technical problem. I should have introduced Fanny before her talk. So may I take a minute to introduce Professor Fanny Cheung now. Professor Fanny Cheung is currently Senior Advisor, Faculty of Social Sciences and the Hong Kong Institute of Asian Pacific Studies. She retired from the Chinese U after serving there for a few decades in the capacity of many important positions, including Vice President for Research, Dean of Faculty of Social Science, Head of Psychology Department, and so forth. So as now, after hearing her talk, you know that Fanny's research expertise lies in cross-cultural personality assessment, psychopathology, gender equality, and women leadership. She has published over 200 journal articles and chapters on these topics. Fanny has served as academic leaders as well. For example, she was the editor-in-chief of Asian Journal of Social Psychology, and she has won a lot of academic awards, including the APA Award for Distinguished Contributions to the International Advancement of Psychology. And as mentioned in the video as well, she also served in IAPP and received the IAPP Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award, among others. Importantly, she is a major driver of Chinese psychology. She has trained generations of Chinese psychologists, and I'm very honored to be among her students. And Fanny was my undergraduate honor thesis advisor when I pursued my undergraduate degree at Chinese University of Hong Kong. And at that time, I was her research helper when she translated and standardized the Chinese MMPI. So you heard about it in her talk. And that was how I first started learning what psychological research is about. So I'm very, very glad that I have this opportunity to introduce my former advisor in this section.
Thank you for inviting me to contribute to the 12th Conference for Chinese Psychologists. I'm excited to see the Thank you for inviting me to contribute to the 12th Conference for Chinese Psychologists. I'm excited to see the continuity of this conference, with which I've been associated for close to 20 years, including the organization of the 6th Conference in Hong Kong in 2008. I'm sorry I cannot join you in person in Taipei due to the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions. In this presentation, I'll reflect on how we can bring a Chinese voice to mainstream psychology by first mapping my own career journey against different stages of cross-cultural psychology. Cultural perspectives enrich our understanding of social behavior, as illustrated by the global responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll end with a call to international Chinese psychology. I'll start by providing a simple summary of the various stages of cross-cultural psychology. Some cross-cultural psychologists have labeled these stages as the etic or imposed etic stage, the emic stage, and the internationalization stage. The etic and emic approaches are key concepts in cross-cultural psychology. The terms were first coined by the linguist Pike to distinguish between etic and emic approaches in anthropology. Stanley, a Chinese-American psychologist, elaborated these concepts in his analysis of cross-cultural psychology in 1983. The etic approach addresses universality of established Western models whereas the emic approach addresses the indigenous or local concepts. As early as in the 1980s, Su has advocated for the need for considering the cultural context in psychology. John Barry, E.P. Poortinger, and their colleagues critique the etic stage as an imposed etic approach. Western models and tests have been transported to non-Western cultures as if they were universally applicable to everyone, without regard for cultural relevance or validity. There are many issues in the transport and test approach that need to be addressed by cross-cultural psychologists. In the case of cross-cultural assessment, we should ask, is the translation and adaptation tests? Unfortunately, many international translations have not observed these guidelines. Is there local research to establish the reliability and validity of the translated test? How do we ensure that the translated test and the original measures are equivalent conceptually and psychometrically? Have ethical use of the tests and copyright permissions been followed? In many emerging economies, these matters are often ignored. Cultural psychologists started to question the universality bias. As a reaction to the imposed etic approach, psychologists in different parts of the world started indigenization movements since the 1970s, especially in Asia and Latin American countries. Part of the motivation came from the resistance to westernization, which is considered a form of intellectual imperialism. Indigenous psychology adopts a bottom-up approach with culturally appropriate methods and constructs to reflect local realities. Chinese indigenous psychology emerged in the mid-1970s in Taiwan. The late Professor Yang Guoshu was the key figure in its development. He recognized the disconnect between Western and Chinese ways of understanding human functioning and promoted Chinese indigenous psychology as a way to address the particular problems encountered in Chinese societies. Chinese indigenous psychology inherently questions the universality of mainstream psychology. Yang and his colleagues, Wang Guangguo and Yang Zhongfang, have been active in studying various Chinese cultural concepts in social psychology. However, the emic approach in many countries suffered from a number of limitations. Most publications are in the local language. By emphasizing on cultural uniqueness, there is little interaction with mainstream psychology, resulting in isolation and marginalization. Increasingly, multiculturalism is becoming a way of life, and cross-cultural psychology needs to enter an internationalization stage. Barry and his colleagues advocated integrating the etic and emic approaches to reach a more balanced view on the universal and culture-specific aspects of psychology. In terms of cross-cultural research methodology for the internationalization stage, my former colleagues and friends, the late Fons van der Wever and Kwok Leung, have promoted the use of a combined emic-etic approach to derive indigenous measures that are relevant for different cultures. Comparing culturally diverse measures for convergence, we can determine etic and emic features. With this backdrop in cross-cultural psychology, I'd like to turn to my personal career journey. A bit of historical context. I grew up in colonial Hong Kong, which followed the British system of administration, rule of law, and education system. However, Chinese customs were preserved, and Confucian value of modesty and harmony prevailed in the local culture. I went to the US for my last year of high school after Form 4 and stayed there until my doctorate. During my undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley, I had the good fortune of taking an independent study under Professor Donald McKinnon, one of the founding members of the famous Institute of Personality Assessment and Research. That stimulated my interest in the study of personality, which was one of the reasons why I chose University of Minnesota for my doctoral studies, as it is famous for its Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, that all first-year students learn in the introductory psychology course. As soon as I arrived at the University of Minnesota, I was ingrained with the concept of despo-empiricism in the psychology department, which demanded to see the empirical evidence for everything. Apart from the psychology department, I also volunteered at the International Student Office, where I learned about cross-cultural communication. I started to become more aware of cultural differences. Upon my graduation, I immediately returned to Hong Kong when many other Chinese students wanted to stay in the US. I felt the responsibility to serve my own community, whereas I would always be a second-class citizen in a foreign land. My first job was in a psychiatry department in a working-class district hospital. The need to use psychological tests there alerted me how unprepared I was, as there were no standardized Chinese translation of the common psychological test that we were taught to use. I joined the Chinese University of Hong Kong in 1977. When China resumed psychology studies after the Cultural Revolution in 1979, I was one of the 4 psychologists from the 2 universities in Hong Kong invited to visit Peking University and the Institute of Psychology. We started my subsequent connection with psychology in mainland. Professor Yang Guoshu visited our psychology section at the Chinese University from 1979 to 1981. He introduced the indigenous movement and social science to our colleagues. During my clinical encounters with local patients, I started to question the limitation of my academic training in meeting the needs of the local Chinese people. To understand Chinese psychopathology, which was not covered in my formal training, I read up literature in cultural psychiatry, which talk about the Chinese somatization tendency. Professor Arthur Kleinman, a cultural psychiatrist at Harvard University, who has conducted early research on depression in Taiwan and China, has written extensively on this tendency. Other cultural psychiatrists offered post hoc interpretations to explain the Chinese somatization tendency, including culture-bound syndrome and the denial of psychological distress among Chinese people. Some even try to argue that the Chinese language is deficient in expressive emotional terms. These did not make sense to me. So I initiated a number of empirical studies and found that Chinese patients would actually admit psychological symptoms if directly asked by the physicians. We may explain this somatization tendency from health-seeking patterns in Chinese society. That is, patients would approach primary care doctors for the physical symptoms, but the friends or family for the psychological needs. Other studies started to show that the somatization is also found in Western societies and is not unique to the Chinese. As a true scholar, Professor Kleiman was very gracious and later changed his conceptualization of somatization as a response to distress and a call for help. Arthur and the late Cheung Kleiman and I have remained good friends. When I left Minnesota, I thought I would not be using the MMPI again in Hong Kong, as it is a long English test with over 500 items. Little did I know that local psychologists have been using it with their individual translation as they administered the test. I embarked on developing a proper Chinese translation, which launched my lifelong association with the test and with the Institute of Psychology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. When the Institute resumed psychology in 1980, they wanted to use the best scientific tool for assessment and decided to translate the MMPI. The researcher assigned to the project, Professor Song Wei-Zhen, had never used the test and was at a loss. At first, she did not know about my work in Hong Kong, which was later introduced to her by the late Professor Raymond Fowler, who was leading an APA delegation to visit China for the first time. Professor Fowler and I were part of the network of international researchers attending conferences on translated versions of the MMPI, organized by Professor James Butcher. Professor Butcher has been most generous in providing training to mainland psychologists on research and applications of the MMPI. From 1981 to year 2000, I've collaborated with Professor Song and her team at the Institute of Psychology to standardize and validate the Chinese MMPI and MMPI-2 with large-scale representative sample and rigorous method. The Chinese version of the test is now distributed by the Chinese University Press under the permission of the University of Minnesota Press. That was the imposed ethic stage of my research in personality assessment. Comparing the scores of the Chinese normative sample with the US norms, we found there are elevations on a number of clinical scales, which may lead to misinterpretation of psychopathology. To address these cultural differences, we warned users to adjust their interpretation accordingly. We also developed our own set of Chinese T-scores based on the Chinese normative sample, as well as a Chinese infrequency scale based on items with extreme percentage of endorsement in the normative sample. Given these cultural differences, I started to ponder why we have to import Western scales and not develop our own personality measure for the Chinese people, which constitute 1/5 of the world population. Based on our experience of standardizing the Chinese MMPI, Professor Song Wei-Zhen and I embarked on the development of the Chinese Personality Assessment Inventory using the combined emic-etic approach. We derived our full constructs of personality empirically through multiple sources using qualitative and quantitative methods. The personality constructs included many that may be regarded as universal across cultures, but also some that are indigenous to our understanding of Chinese personality. After deriving the constructs, our Hong Kong and mainland research team worked together to regroup and write additional items for the constructs. We conducted large-scale studies to select items based on their psychometric properties. We then standardized the CPAI and later the revised CPAI-2 to develop national norms using representative samples with quota sampling in mainland China and random household sampling in Hong Kong. There are 28 personality scales, 12 clinical scales, and 3 validity scales in the current version of the CPAI-2. Using factor analysis, we extracted 4 normal personality factors and 2 clinical factors. Some indigenous scales were loaded with other etic scales in 3 of the personality factors. For example, family orientation was loaded on the dependability factor. RQ mentality and self versus other orientation were loaded on the accommodation factor, which reflect the role of these Chinese characteristics in defining the universal personality constructs. Harmony, 人情, traditionalism, discipline, and thrift formed the interpersonal relatedness factor. One of the challenges to indigenously derived personality measures is its incremental validity beyond the established models. Has CPAI identified culture-specific constructs that could not be subsumed under the universal models of personality? Up till now, the dominant personality theory in psychology is the 5-factor model, which claims to represent the universal structure of personality. Many international psychologists just adopted the 5-factor model in the personality research without question. In cross-cultural research of the 5-factor model, it has been found that some of the factors, such as openness, were not as coherent as claimed. How does the CPAI differ from the FFM? Has it identified emic constructs that could not be covered under the FFM? To address this question, we conducted studies using joint factor analysis of a measure of the 5-factor model and the CPAI, and later CPAI-2, and found that 3 of the 4 CPAI personality factors mapped onto the 5-factor model and may be regarded as universal or etic factors. The combination of extroversion and openness in the social potency factor in the CPAI-2 suggests that these 2 big 5 factors are less distinct, with openness covering a more interpersonal dimension in Chinese samples. Similarly, emotional stability or neuroticism and conscientiousness define dependability in Chinese culture. In the joint factor structure, the CPAI-2 interpersonal relatedness factor formed a unique factor and did not load on any of the big 5 factors. The IR factor consists of scales reflecting confusion characteristics, which some Chinese colleagues described as 内向外黄 or 内方外圆, and may be regarded as a truly emic factor. Our own research and those by other researchers provided evidence for the incremental validity of the emic CPAI-2 IR factor in a range of different psychological outcomes. I won't go through all the studies here. Those who are interested in the research can look up the CPAI2 bibliography available online. Is the CPAI interpersonal relatedness factor unique to the Chinese only? We further examined the relevance of the CPAI emic constructs in a reversed emic-etic approach, in which the CPAI2 was translated by international researchers and tried out in their own cultures. Understandably, the IR factor was more intact in Asian and Asian American samples, but less so in individualistic cultures such as the Dutch and white American samples. The incremental validity of the CPAI and its empirical research grounding led it to be recognized as the most solid indigenously derived personality measure. Through the introduction of the late Fons van der Wever, the CPAI model was adopted as the blueprint for the development of indigenous personality measures in South Africa and the Arab-Levant region. In the past, cross-cultural psychology used to be marginalized to the fringes. To advocate the need to incorporate the cultural perspective in psychology, I published 2 papers in American Psychologists promoting the integration of the global and local perspectives in psychology rather than dichotomizing the emic versus etic approach. Other international psychologists are also calling for the need to broaden the representativeness of psychological science. Jones first pointed out in the 2010 article in Science that psychology is way too weird. That is, most participants in psychology research come from white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries, while they represent only 12% of the world population. Heinrich and his colleagues further show that 80% of psychology research participants were from weird countries. Many years after the alarm has been raised, Rad and his colleagues analyzed all articles published in Psychological Science within the year 2014 and then in 2017. They still found the lack of representation of the global population in samples used in psychology studies. This phenomenon is still ongoing. The lack of representation and generalizability undermine the core goals of psychological science, which should be to understand human universals and the way in which context and culture produce variability. The relevance of cultural perspectives is well demonstrated in understanding different responses to the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Gelfand and her associates analyzed data from 57 countries in terms of the success in limiting COVID cases and deaths up to October 2020. Based on the previous national measures of cultural tightness versus looseness, nations with high levels of cultural looseness have close to 5 times more the number of cases and 8.7 times more the number of deaths. They interpret that tight groups cooperate much faster under threat and have higher survival rates than the loose groups. It has been observed in Western countries, citizens vehemently object to orders to wear masks, which they consider to be an infringement of their personal freedom. In Asian countries, citizens are more compliant with prevention measures. Likewise, Western governments' actions are mostly non-interfering and relied on individuals' autonomy and responsibility. heritage of Confucianism in East Asia encourages a more collective mindset, and governments adopt a more preventive and protective stance. Studies also confirm that more individualistic persons have less adherence to epidemic prevention measures. Other studies further show that knowledge, attitudes, and practices influence the individual's adoption of prevention measures against infectious disease due to the impact on emotions and response to stress. Trust in government also plays an important role in compliance to the pandemic prevention measures. Studies have shown that people who endorse hierarchy and collectivism and who pay attention to news tend to have better trust in government. International surveys have shown that public trust in government in China has been consistently high, even throughout the pandemic. Studies showed that Chinese respondents have confidence in the government's battle against COVID-19 and are optimistic toward the pandemic. These attitudes and responses contrast with those reactions in Western countries. It is evident that internationalizing psychology and mainstreaming a cultural perspective is good for psychological science. Reflecting on my own career journey, I've worked in my small way to help to internationalize psychology. Beyond my research, which has brought a Chinese voice to broaden the cultural perspective in psychology, I actively promoted the international mindset in psychologists. For example, during the International Congress of Psychology in Beijing in 2004, I arranged an APA delegation to meet with the All China Women's Federation to debunk the myth about China's one-child policy, which was equated with infanticide in Western narratives. I hosted international visitors and brought the International Test Commission Conference to Hong Kong in 2010 to connect international psychologists with Chinese and Asian psychologists. I helped to network Asian psychologists at international congresses organized by the International Association of Applied Psychology. To incorporate the international and intersectional perspectives in psychology of women, I co-edited the Cambridge Handbook of International Psychology of Women in 2020 with Professor Diane Halpern, which involved over 100 international authors from all countries in the world, including many Chinese scholars. Our young colleagues may ask, how do we get started to become more internationalized? First and foremost, we need to get out of our comfort zone and reach out. Participate in international conferences, visit institutions in other countries, engage in cross-cultural research collaboration, broaden our research to inform a universal perspective so we can publish in mainstream journals, serve as reviewers and journal editorial boards members, contribute to committees of international associations, and so on. Grounded in our own culture, we can form our Welt and Schauen, which constitute a comprehensive conception of the world and the place of humanity within it. We can then pivot to Asia and the rest of the world. We need to open our minds to understand and appraise other cultures and perspectives. This provides the foundation for us to critically evaluate Chinese psychology and contribute to the knowledge base in psychology. Psychology should provide a diverse and inclusive knowledge base that represent all the people in the world. As Chinese psychologists representing 1/5 of humanity, you can make important contributions to the future of psychology. Thank you.
So now, after hearing her talk, I want to open the floor to Q&A. So we still have about 15 minutes. So feel free. There are two ways. Either you type your question in the chat, but you need to open it to everybody. So make sure it's sent to everyone, and you can type your question there. Or if you like, please unmute yourself and ask the question to Fanny directly. So Fanny is here with us. Yeah, so she will answer your questions. Or even, just say hi or give some comments. So I saw familiar faces, saw familiar names. So yeah, please, you can unmute yourself if you want. So I think the topic of Fanny's talk is very tiny. It talks about, at the end, how, for example, one thing she mentioned is how psychologists can contribute to the global societies. So I think the main theme of this talk is about COVID. If you have done any research or have, any experience about how your place, your community cope with COVID, yeah, please share your view as well. And we establish, we especially encourage young scholars to voice their comments, their questions. So, yes, please.
Yeah. And have Professor Fanny Zhang. I'm Guang Hui Ye. I'm Guang Hui Ye.
Guang Hui, yeah.
Hi, Guang Hui.
Thank you for your talk. Wonderful talk. About your CPAI, you introduce your. I use Chinese to ask you. It's okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. 你的 CPI 发展得很好，从就是本土的，然后到跨文化到国际的，然后你有很多的一些应用。那你现在呼吁就是说我们应该慢慢走到国际化。那你可不可以 Fanny 可不可以跟我们讲一讲就是说在你过去这40几年，将近50年的这些研究当中有哪些你觉得可能年轻学者需要去注意的很关键的，就是从本土化走到国际化这样的一个过程当中他可能要进一步去思考，然后也许可以提供给年轻学者或年轻学生的一些想法。以上是我的小小问题，谢谢。
Thank you.
谢谢光辉。If you don't mind, I'll use English because I'll be able to speak faster in English and Guangdonghua won't do here. It's a very good question. In fact, during my early stage of my career in the development of the CPAI, I encountered strong resistance from mainstream psychology in publication. They questioned why Chinese psychology, and especially from the Big Five camp, because they dominated research in personality psychology. That was even before Western personality psychologists in Europe started to question the universal structure of the five factor. So initially, we had difficulty publishing in the dominant mainstream journals. However, I was very fortunate that cross-cultural psychology journals were more receptive to these non-Western based perspectives. And so I was able to publish there, which started the interest of other cross-cultural psychologists, and we can start to have a voice. I think what's important for younger psychologists to remember is that when we try to publish in mainstream journals, we need to bring in a international perspective and a comparative perspective that can help the non-Western psychologists to see how the research is also relevant to them. I still remember some of the reviewers in the American journal say, why are we interested in Chinese psychology? It has nothing to do with us. Well, of course, maybe nowadays with the geopolitical perspective, they are more interested in Chinese psychology. However, at that time, they themselves are also very ethnocentric and isolationist. So we need to, first of all, do good empirical research so that it meets the standard of the international journals. And second, when we try to illustrate our uniqueness, our emic construct, we need to provide that cultural perspective and comparative perspective to illustrate that it has incremental validity, it has added value beyond what they already know. I think after several decades, it's a growing trend. Even in mainstream psychology, they are questioning why psychology is so weird. However, we need to still encounter some of these resistances by bringing in good research. I hope, no, in one way, that answers some of your question.
Yeah. So the floor is open. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm actually interested because in my own review on the COVID-19 research and the cultural perspective, I was only accessing the English language publications. And for Chinese psychologists in both the mainland and in Taiwan, oftentimes the research are published in Chinese. I'd like to hear whether they have similar research that can be shared and that can reinforce our assertion that cultural perspective is very important and it has very practical implications on public health and also in helping solve social problems in societies. Yeah, feel free to share your research with us too. I think Yingyi, you published in English, but it was in political psychology, so I missed that. No, you can share what you found.
Yeah, thank you, Fanny. Might be, I was thinking whether I should advertise two special issues that we have published in the Journal of Pacific Rim Psychology that pertain to COVID-19. And actually one of the special issue is on conspiracy theory related to infectious disease. And so that this special issue has come out already. So you can search on the internet and it's open access. So you can download all the articles in that special issues. We have 10 articles in there from all over the world. And so including, research on conspiracy theory endorsement in our area here in Asia. So, and other issues that will come out very soon, later this year or early next year, is about the mental health issues related to COVID-19. And in that one, we have about half of the articles, 6 or 7 articles, is about mental health situations in Asia. So that one might be of relevancy to our discussion today. So I think, there are a lot of interesting research from this from this region that look at COVID-19. I think we all are facing different problems or different issues related to our own context. It could be social, political, cultural context. And because, one thing I learned, when I was in grad school is oftentimes when you look at psychological issues, it's P by S. We call it P, times S, meaning oftentimes, there are some individual, aspect. And these individual aspects could be related to our socialization, cultural heritage, etc. But also the situation. The situation now, the pandemic, of course, is a lot of pressure on individuals to cope with it, but also the social institution as well. So in each of the regions, we have different regulations, different policy towards social distancing and whatnot. So I think, most of the articles that I'm looking at is to address this P by S interplay. So I think that's what I observe, relating to this. And I myself look at how national identification might be related to disease preventive behaviors. And I did longitudinal research in mainland China and the United States. So I can look at the causal inference of national identification and disease preventive behavior, and how the disease preventive behavior in turn affect national identification. And the paper has been published in Political Psychology as well. So if you're interested, please, you can look at it, on your own. Thanks. So maybe other people, we still have some time. So anyone want to ask a question or give a comment? I bet, many of you might be studying this topic as well. So I see a comment. So Joe, you want to unmute yourself? You have a question, right?
Yes, thank you, Ying and Fanny.
Yes, please.
Yes, because after the impact of the pandemic, I think the lifestyle of a lot of citizens have been changed, and also within the 3 years of the impact, so the life, I think, have altered a lot. So based on your research, based on your professional experience, do you think after those problems arise, the personality construct of Chinese will be affected? And that is my questions.
Fanny, great question.
Well, that's a great question. No, it relates to what you was talking about, P times S. Personality is relatively stable, whereas the situation can affect the way the personality is manifested in behavioral responses. So in some of our early research, looking at decades of changes through modernization in China, we found very little change in the basic structure of personality, even with modernization, because remember, we started in the early 1990s with this first version of the CPAI. That was before the rapid economic development in China. But the CPAI 2 was in after the new millennium. So a lot has changed in mainland China in terms of its economic development and modernization. However, the basic personality structure in terms of the factor structure has not changed that much, with one exception we found, and that was with thrift versus extravagance. In the early days, when China was still relatively poor, thrift was a very important construct. It's part of the agricultural mentality in China, that we need to be thrifty and not waste physical and material things. Whereas with the younger generation and the new millennium generation, thrift becomes a much weaker factor. In fact, it is loading on the IR factor has been weakened. So you can see some shift in personality constructs and its importance to the personality structure. However, I would think that behavior manifestation would alter more than personality structure, even after the pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you, Fanny. So, yeah, we reached the end of this section. Thank you so much for attending. I wish you a good conference. And so we are closing the keynote section. Thank you. So I give the floor back to the host. Thank you.
Thank you.
谢谢。